Hey guys, Mr. Bowman here. Today's learning objective is in orange and we're learning to describe the seasonal effect in a time series graph. So the key part of today's learning objective is the seasonal effect. And during your kind of project, assignment, internal, we're going to use some computer software to create this graph here. And this graph is how you'll analyze the seasonal effect. So you can see you've got quarter one, quarter two, quarter three, quarter four, and you can see it is below, above, slightly below. And using this graph, you'll be able to describe what happens across a year, or how does the season impact the data. So before we get into that, let's try to understand where exactly does this graph come from. You don't need to draw it and calculate it yourself. But let's try to figure out what exactly the computer software is doing to get that particular graph. So we'll get rid of the one. So hopefully you're happy. This is a regular time series graph, and we can see the time of the year relates to the quarter. So we can have quarter one, quarter two, quarter three, quarter four. Quarter one all the way up to quarter four within each year, and we're measuring in this case the number of plantation forests over time between 2000 and 2014. So that's what we're doing here. So once you've done that, what would have happened, the grapher would have put an average line. So this is the long-term trend. So it's not as simple as a straight line. You can see it kind of curves as the data goes up and down. So that long-term trend line is really, really important, and that's how we impact, or how we calculate that graph we looked at before. So I'm going to flip over to another graph that you'll see NZ Grapher create, and this is this colorful one here. And each different color, you can kind of see there's 2012, that's 2002, you can see 2009 there as well. All the years are there, but what you can see is each color represents 1 year. And what that does is that tells you about the value. So for example, if we looked here, so that dot down the very bottom there, that's the beginning of our data. That's in the early 2000s. And whilst it's difficult to see, we can see this orange line here relates to 2000s. And we can see our equivalent point just over there. So we can see every year what's happening. And what happens here is we're going to calculate the distance, what is the difference between that particular point and the trend line. And we're going to do that again for the next quarter one. Again, what is that distance? And we're going to do the same here. What is that distance? So that distance we call the residual. And that's the difference between the trend line, and we'll call it the raw data, the actual values. And we've done that for every single point. And what we do is we then add up all of these numbers, and that will give us a quarter one average. And when I flip over to the graph we had to start off with, that's what this here represents. So that average of quarter one differences is shown in this graph. So every quarter one, so we had there, we had there, we had there, there. Forgive me as I'm rushing through that. All of those averages are added up, so they're all negative numbers because you can see they're below the trend line. And that's why our average is a trend line. So on average, in quarter one, we're just estimating here, that's maybe about 425. It is 425 below that long-term trend line. It then repeats that process for quarter two, quarter three, and quarter four. And that results in the seasonal trend graph that we've seen. So we're now back on our original slide, and just a reminder, this context related to plantation forests. To be honest, I don't really know what plantation forests are. In the real internal, I would have gone away. I would have researched what exactly this is, so I know what it's about. but for this discussion, I won't stress too much about it. So when we've been asked to analyze or discuss the seasonal effects, we're trying to tell a story. So it's a bit of a story time, a story of what happens throughout a year. And I'm going to use the word typical here actually, because every so often the pattern you see doesn't really follow throughout a typical year. Okay, so let's get into that. We're going to start off with quarter one. Forgive me as I've knocked over something in the background. Quarter one there. So again, key thing is we're telling a bit of a story. So a typical year for the number of plantation forests starts in quarter one. So I'm using some context. Starts in quarter one, and maybe in brackets I'll explain what that means. So that refers to January, February, and March. At approximately, using the word approximately because I am just reading off the graph, I might be slightly wrong. Approximately, and we said before that was about 425, approximately 425 plantation forests below our trend line. So that's where we start. So a typical year, we're starting here. Now, as the year passes, we kind of move up in this direction here, and we end up being at quarter two over here, and going across that looks to be about 250 here. So what we're going to say is after quarter one. So let's start writing that. So after quarter one, the number of plantation forests appears to increase to about, and again, about, kind of the same word as approximately, 250, we'll just call it forests above the trend line. So I've explained what's happened here, and because this is at its highest point, maybe I want to mention that quarter two is typically the highest time of the year. I should note that quarter two is typically when the number of forest plantations or plantation forests is at its highest during a given year. We're now shifting over to quarter three, and it does appear there to be a slight decrease, and maybe slightly below that. We'll call that 225. Again, I'm estimating here. So following quarter two, there is typically a slight decrease. To quarter three, to approximately 225 forestry plantations above the long-term trend line. Approximately 225 plantation forests above the trend line. Okay, Finally, we're going to finish up our story by explaining that there is a bit of a decline from quarter 3 to quarter 4. And then finally, from quarter 3 to quarter 4, I'll just make it sound a bit fancier. From quarter 3 to quarter 4, we see a significant drop in the number of forestry plantations or plantation forests. Well, forgive my messy handwriting there. To approximately, and this is when we're going to need to look at our graph to see what number that is roughly below the trend line. So looking at that, that's a tiny number. Let's call that maybe 50, but that's probably a bit too much. Approximately 50 below our trend line. So that ended our typical year. So what we've done here is we've got 4 parts to our conversation. One relates to quarter 1, then we've got quarter 2, then we've got quarter 3, and then finally we've got quarter 4. And that narrates and chats about what's happening. So in time series, it is actually quite easy to push your answer up from achieve to merit. If you were thinking, well, how can I improve this answer? I would probably talk about, for my green conversation, I might talk about this is when it's at the lowest every year. In addition to that, for each point, I might want to talk about why. So using my contextual knowledge. So why was it at its lowest at this point here? Why did it increase so dramatically from quarter 1 to quarter 2? Why did it barely change from quarter 2 to quarter 3? And then finally, why did we observe a bit of a drop from quarter 3 to quarter 4? Now, with forestry plantations, you might be thinking of kind of reasons, what's happening in the forest that explains this. So, for example, the big jump from quarter 1 to quarter 2, that might have been planting season, where we went from hardly any forests to quite a few new ones, because that's the time of the year you're meant to plant them up. And then maybe from quarter 2 to quarter 3, there's no change there because you're letting all those forests grow. So you're not actually chopping them down, they're just growing. It also might be something to do with, well, it's winter, it's too cold to plant anything else, it's too wet to chop anything down, so you just leave it as it is. And then finally, there's a bit of a drop from quarter 3 to quarter 4. Maybe this is when some of these forests are culled. The weather's getting a bit better, the soil might be firmer, maybe you can get the big machinery in and you can actually harvest some of these trees or forests for whatever reason. So if you're able to think about why, that's what's going to get you to merit. And the really big one, I'm writing down the very bottom, plus research. If you're able to go out and find someone who discusses a forestry plantation, who discusses the issues you've raised and confirms why these things are happening, that is how you can push your merit answer all the way up to an excellence answer as well. So hopefully you found this introduction to describing seasonal effects useful. Gosh, I just realized I've got a typo here, to scribble, but we'll ignore that. Thanks so much for watching. Now, it's really important that we get into heaps and heaps of practice.